Okay, so today we're going to do a deep dive into a movie that I'm sure a lot of people have at least heard of, even if they haven't seen it.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
The 1959 epic Ben-Hur, and I mean, I gotta say, I've always been kind of fascinated by this film, just the sheer scale of it.
Oh, absolutely. I
Yeah.
mean, it's one of those movies that just really captures the imagination right from the start, you know?
Yeah, and we're using the film's Wikipedia page as our guide for this one, so we'll be digging into all sorts of stuff: the production, the reception, the impact it's had.
I think it's going to be really interesting to kind of unpack why this movie became such a phenomenon and why it still holds up today. I mean, it's really considered one of the greatest films ever made.
Yeah, it really is, and we've got to start by acknowledging that this wasn't the first time this story came to the big screen, right?
Hmm.
I mean, the source material for this film is Lew Wallace's novel Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ.
Exactly. And there were actually two silent film adaptations before this one in 1907 and then a more ambitious one in 1925.
Okay, so this 1959 version was stepping into a story that already had some cinematic history.
Yeah, it did. And, those earlier films, especially the 1925 one, they kind of paved the way in a sense. They showed that this epic story could be brought to life on screen.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah.
And just looking at the stats for this 1959 film, it's clear that they were going all out. I mean, 216 minutes, that's almost 4 hours long.
Yeah, that's a commitment for sure.
And that super wide aspect ratio, 2.76.1, it screams epic. Yeah.
It does. It's like they wanted to make sure that you felt the grandeur of the story in every single frame.
Yeah, and that width wasn't just for aesthetics either. It actually gave director William Wyler this huge canvas to work with, right? I mean, it allowed him to stage these massive scenes with hundreds of extras and these really sweeping camera movements.
Absolutely. And I think that visual style really contributed to the film's immersive quality. You really feel like you're transported back to ancient Rome and Judea.
Okay, so we've talked about the scale of the film, but the subtitle, A Tale of the Christ, that's really significant too, right?
It is. It tells you right away that this is a story that's set against this massive historical and spiritual backdrop. And it really adds another layer of depth to Ben-Hur's personal journey.
Yeah, it's like his story is unfolding alongside one of the most important events in human history.
Exactly. And the way they handled the portrayal of Jesus in the film is really interesting, too. Claude Heater plays Jesus, but we never actually see his face.
Yeah, I remember that. Kind of adds to the mystery and reverence surrounding the character, right?
It does, like they wanted to acknowledge the importance of Jesus in the story without overshadowing Ben-Hur himself.
Yeah, and that approach probably wouldn't fly today.
Probably not.
Okay, so let's not forget the critical acclaim that this film received. It premiered at Cannes in 1960 and was almost instantly hailed as one of the best films ever made.
And then it went on to win a record-breaking 11 Academy Awards, which is just mind-blowing.
Yeah, that record stood for 38 years and has only been tied twice since then by Titanic and The Lord of the Rings, Return of the King.
Wow, it really makes you wonder what it was about this particular film that resonated so deeply with audiences and critics alike.
Yeah, what do you think it was?
Well, I think a big part of it is the story itself. It's this classic tale of betrayal, revenge, and ultimately redemption. It's a story that's been told and retold throughout history, but I think Ben-Hur does a really masterful job of bringing it to life in this epic and visually stunning way.
Okay, so let's dive into the story a bit more. The central conflict is between Judah Ben-Hur, a Jewish prince, and Messala, his Roman friend.
Right, and that friendship turns sour when Messala returns to Jerusalem as a Roman tribune. He's embraced Roman culture, and he expects Judah to do the same, but Judah remains loyal to his people and his faith, and that leads to a really dramatic falling out.
Yeah, and it's not just a war of words either. I mean, Messala falsely accuses Judah of treason and condemns him to slavery.
It's a brutal betrayal, and it really sets the stage for Ben-Hur's quest for revenge.
Yeah, and his time as a galley slave is just brutal. But there's this really pivotal moment where he meets Jesus, who offers him water. It's such a small act of kindness, but it really has a profound impact on him.
It does, and I think it kind of foreshadows Ben-Hur's eventual path to redemption.
Yeah.
Even in the midst of all this suffering and hardship, he's still capable of compassion and forgiveness.
So Ben-Hur eventually escapes slavery, and he ends up saving the life of a Roman consul, Quintus Arrius, who adopts him as his son.
Yeah, and this is where Ben-Hur's fortunes really start to change. He becomes this celebrated charioteer in Rome, and he could have easily just stayed there and lived a life of luxury.
But he can't let go of the past, right? I mean, he still wants revenge against Messala, and he still yearns to find his mother and sister who he believes were killed.
And that's what drives him back to Jerusalem.
So he returns to Judea, and he meets Balthazar, one of the wise men, and Sheikh Elderim, who owns a team of chariot horses.
And this is where the seeds are planted for the iconic chariot race, right? I mean, Ildrim sees Ben-Hur's potential, and he agrees to train him for the race.
But Ben-Hur's motivations are complex at this point. It's not just about winning the race or even about defeating Masala.
Right. He wants to use the race as a way to humiliate Masala to get revenge for what he did to him and his family.
And when he finally returns to Jerusalem, he learns that his mother and sister are still alive, but they've contracted leprosy, and they've been sent to the Valley of the Lepers.
Yeah, and this news just fuels Ben-Hur's rage even more. He's determined to make Masala pay.
So the stage is set for the chariot race, which is arguably the most famous scene in the entire film.
Yeah, it's a sequence that's just burned into cinematic history. I mean, the sheer scale of it, the action, the drama, it's just incredible.
And it's not just a spectacle either. I mean, Wyler really uses the race to explore the characters and their motivations. You can see the desperation in Ben-Hur's eyes, the ruthlessness in Masala's.
Absolutely, and the way Wyler builds tension throughout the race is masterful. You know, he uses these wide shots to show the grandeur of the event, but then he cuts to these really tight close-ups to show the intensity of the struggle.
And there's this great anecdote about an unplanned accident during the race.
Oh yeah, tell me about it.
So Joe Knut, Yakima Knut's son, was one of the stuntmen in the race, and at one point he gets thrown from his chariot. But he manages to grab hold and pull himself back in.
Wow, that's crazy.
And they actually kept that shot in the film. It adds this real element of danger and unpredictability to the scene.
It really does, and you know, it's a testament to the skill of those stuntmen that they were able to perform those incredibly dangerous maneuvers.
Yeah, it's amazing. So Ben-Hur wins the race, but Masala is mortally wounded, and before he dies, he reveals that Ben-Hur's mother and sister are still alive, but they're in the Valley of the Lepers.
It's a cruel twist of fate. You know, Ben-Hur has achieved his revenge, but at a terrible cost.
And this is where the film really starts to shift towards redemption, right? I mean, Ben-Hur is devastated by the news about his family, and he goes to the Valley of the Lepers to find them.
And then, of course, you have the crucifixion of Jesus, which Ben-Hur witnesses firsthand, and it's this incredibly powerful moment that changes him completely.
It's like he realizes that revenge isn't the answer and that there's a different path forward.
And his mother and sister are miraculously healed after Jesus' death, which further reinforces this idea of redemption and forgiveness.
And the film ends with this really evocative image of a shepherd and the empty crosses at Golgotha.
It's a beautiful and hopeful ending, you know. It suggests that even in the face of great suffering and loss, there's always the possibility of new beginnings.
Okay, so we've talked about the story, but let's dive into the production of this film, which was an absolutely massive undertaking.
Oh yeah, it was a huge gamble for MGM, which was struggling financially at the time.
Yeah, they poured a ton of money into this film. I mean, the budget was $15 million, which was an astronomical sum back then.
And they hired William Wyler, who was one of the most respected directors in Hollywood at the time, and they paid him a $1 million salary, which was unheard of.
Yeah, they were really putting all their eggs in this basket.
And they built these massive sets at Cinecittà in Rome. I mean, the scale of the production was just incredible.
Yeah, the naval battle scene alone is just mind-boggling. They actually built a huge tank to film that scene, and they used large-scale models to simulate the ships.
And the chariot race was filmed on this massive set that they built outside of Rome, and they used hundreds of extras and stuntmen.
Yeah, and they even used mannequins in some of the more dangerous shots.
It's amazing to think about the level of detail and planning that went into creating these scenes.
Yeah, and it's clear that they were learning from the mistakes of the previous adaptations. You know, they didn't want to repeat the dangerous open ocean filming that had been done in the 1925 version.
And, you know, it's worth noting that Sergio Leone, who would later become famous for directing spaghetti westerns like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, he actually worked on the second unit for the chariot race.
Oh, wow. So he was involved in this film.
Yeah, and you can kind of see his signature style in some of those action sequences.
Okay, so the production was epic, but the scriptwriting and casting process also had their fair share of drama.
They did. There were reportedly tons of different scripts floating around before they finally settled on one by Charlton.
But William Wyler wasn't entirely satisfied with the script, so he brought in Gore Vidal to do some uncredited rewrites.
Yeah, and Vidal later claimed that he tried to inject a homosexual subtext into the relationship between Ben-Hur and Masala, but Wyler rejected the idea.
Yeah, that's a pretty juicy piece of Hollywood gossip.
It is. And, the casting of Judah Ben-Hur was a big deal. They considered a lot of different actors, including Paul Newman, Marlon Brando, and Burt Lancaster. But they ultimately went with Charlton Heston.
Yeah, and Heston gives us really powerful performance. He really embodies the character's strength and determination.
And the casting of Masala was interesting, too. They actually considered Leslie Nielsen for the role before ultimately casting Stephen Boyd.
Wow, Leslie Nielsen. It's hard to imagine him as a Roman tribune.
Yeah, he would later become famous for his comedic roles, but he was actually a pretty versatile actor early in his career.
And the supporting cast is really strong, too.
Yeah.
You have Haya Hareed as Esther Martha Scott, as Miriam, and Kathy O'Donnell as Tirza.
Yeah, and it's interesting to note that Harari was the only Jewish actress in a principal role, which is kind of odd considering the subject matter of the film.
Okay, so we've talked about the story, the production, the script writing, and the casting, but we can't forget the music.
Right, the music is absolutely essential to the film's emotional impact.
Yeah, Miklos Rozsa's score is just incredible. It's so sweeping and dramatic, and it really elevates those key moments.
It does, and it's interesting to note that most of the score was actually recorded in Rome by Carlos Savina, while Rozsa himself conducted some of the sessions in the U.S.
Wow, so it was a really international collaboration.
Yeah, and the DVD and Blu-ray releases of the film actually include some additional musical sequences that weren't in the original theatrical release.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like the overture, the intermission, and the entr'acte. It just goes to show how important the music is to the overall experience of watching the film.
So how did the film do at the box office?
It was a massive hit. It was the highest grossing film of 1959, and it held that record for several years.
And when you adjust for inflation, it's one of the highest grossing films of all time.
Yeah, it really captured the public's imagination, and it's still considered to be one of the greatest films ever made.
And its influence can be seen in countless other films, right? I mean,
Yeah.
The Chariot Race has been referenced and parodied in so many different movies and TV shows.
Yeah, and it's been cited as a direct inspiration for the pod race sequence in Star Wars episode Eye of the Phantom Menace.
Wow, so George Lucas was clearly a fan.
And there was a remake of Ben-Hur that was released in 2016, but it didn't really come close to capturing the magic of the original.
Yeah, I think the 1959 film is just one of those movies that's really hard to top.
It is. It's a perfect storm of great storytelling, incredible filmmaking, and a timeless message.
Okay, so to wrap things up, let's talk about the legacy of Ben-Hur. It won a record-breaking 11 Academy Awards, and it's been recognized by the American Film Institute as one of the greatest American films of all time.
And it's still studied and admired by filmmakers and film critics today.
Yeah, it's a film that continues to inspire and entertain audiences all over the world.
And I think that's because it taps into some really universal themes, betrayal, revenge, redemption. It's a story that's as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago.
So what do you think it is about these epic films that continues to draw us in?
Well, I think it's the combination of the grand scale, the spectacle, and the human drama. We're drawn to stories that are bigger than ourselves, but that also have these really relatable characters and emotions.
Yeah, and I think Ben-Hur does a really great job of balancing those elements. It's a film that's both epic and intimate, and it leaves you with this feeling of hope and possibility, even in the face of great adversity.
Absolutely. And I think that's a message that we can all appreciate.
Okay, well, that's our deep dive into Ben-Hur. What are your final thoughts on this film?
Well, I think it's a true cinematic masterpiece. It's a film that's both entertaining and thought-provoking. And it's one that I think will continue to be enjoyed for generations to come.
So if you haven't seen it yet, I highly recommend checking it out.
Yeah, it's definitely worth the watch. And if you have seen it, it might be time for a rewatch. You might be surprised by how much you pick up on the second time around.
Yeah, and there are so many different layers to this film that you can really keep discovering new things each time you watch it.
And it's a film that can really spark some interesting conversations, about history, religion, and the human condition.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the film itself, but I want to leave you with a final thought. What elements do you think contribute most to a film's timeless appeal, and how does Ben-Hur, with all its grandeur and historical context, measure up against the modern epics that we see today? It's definitely something to think about. And maybe it'll inspire you to revisit this classic or even seek out some other epic films that you haven't seen before. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It was a pleasure being here.
And we'll see you next time.
Sounds good.